Earth speaks of creation and life, the rise and fall of mountain ranges. Countless millions of life forms ranging from the microscopic to the gigantic have lived before us. No animal who has ever walked the earth holds more fascination for our imaginations than do the dinosaurs. The dinosaurs represent only a short span in the history that has made up Earth's past. The landmass which now constitutes Utah is unique in the volume of Jurassic dinosaurs which have been found here. There is no place on Earth which has contributed more to the understanding of Jurassic dinosaurs than has the enormous fossilized collection of bones found in Utah. The Jurassic Period received its name in 1879 when Alexander von Humboldt named it after the Jura Mountains on the border of France and Switzerland. The Jurassic Period began about 213 million years ago and lasted for some 65 to 70 million years. Millions of years is a difficult concept to grasp. Where did the dinosaurs fit in reference to all other life forms on Earth? Where is the reference point between the dinosaurs' existence and our own? How does the creation of the Earth itself fit into the timeline of all living things the Earth has given rise to? To best understand how life and the dinosaurs fit into Earth's timeline, we must have an understanding of the history of Earth itself.
Dinosaurs are everybody's favorite group of prehistoric animals, and we all know that they lived millions and millions of years ago during what the geologists call the Mesozoic era. Specifically, that period of time began around 245 million years ago and ended about 65 million years ago. But who can imagine how long ago that was? We live, if we're lucky, for maybe a century, and our daily lives are organized around minutes and hours and days and weeks. And yet the history of our planet encompasses 4.6 billion years of time. We can scarcely fathom the dimensions of such an immense period. To make it a little bit easier for us to understand when the dinosaurs lived on our planet and what part of the history they occupied, we've plotted up the history at a scale of 1 inch per 10 million years on this piece of tape. Let's unroll it and have a look at the history of our planet. Let's take a walk down the road of geologic time at a scale of 10 million years per each inch. At that scale, each footstep is equivalent to about 300 million years. During the early history of our planet, the ocean basins and the continents formed. Volcanoes discharged gases which helped build our atmosphere. In the world's first seas, life originated as very primitive single-celled creatures which ultimately evolved into more and more complex forms of life. Those living things came out of the seas and colonized the world's continental environments. Complex living creatures have existed on our planet for just the last 57 inches on this 42-foot-long representation of geologic time. Let's examine that brief interval in more detail. We know that our world was totally lifeless for just about the first billion years or so of its history. By 3.5 billion years ago, the world's first living creatures had evolved in the primordial seas, but they were very rare and very primitive and evolved very slowly. Organized and complex and abundant life has only been common on Earth for the last 500 or 600 million years, and that encompasses just 57 inches on our geologic timescale. These limestone cliffs in Utah's lakeside mountains represent the mud and the ooze that accumulated on the floor of a shallow, warm, tropical sea about 600 million years ago. That seafloor was populated by a bizarre array of creatures. Famous among them are Utah's trilobites, distant relatives of the modern crabs and shrimp and lobsters. They were the grazers, the kings of the Cambrian world, and the seafloor that they lived on was carpeted by slimy layers of algae, which trapped the sediment, bound it into laminated forms that we call stromatolites. The edges that emerge on this rock represent the individual layers of those films of algae. These creatures were very important in the history of life because they were photosynthetic, and they were creating oxygen which escaped into the atmosphere to create a protective shield against the harmful radiation of the sun.
450 million years ago, life on our planet existed mostly in the ocean. The array of animals which lived in the seas at that point in time was much more abundant and more diverse than the animals that originated back in the Cambrian. The reason for this proliferation is that animal life had developed hard parts, hard exoskeletons made of calcium carbonate. 200 million years before dinosaurs lived in Utah, the western part of the state was submerged under the ocean. The rocks that formed on the seafloor are rich in the fossils of that period. The exoskeleton structures of these ancient animals allowed their remains to be preserved. The dinosaurs dominated the Earth's terrestrial system for 140 million years, going through numerous cycles of extinction and evolution. The last dinosaurs died out about 65 million years ago, and the great age of mammals followed.
This 50-million-year-old fossil leaf from the Cenozoic era is virtually identical to many of the modern plants that surround us today. This is a fossil skull of a mammal known as an oreodont, an ancestor of the sheep and the pigs, very similar to creatures that we know in our own world. And where would the human beings fit in on this scale of geologic time? If I lay one finger across the last quarter inch of the geologic time scale, I can encompass the entire evolutionary history of our species. So it's only been for about the last 600 million years that life has been abundant and diverse on our planet. That's only 60 inches on this 42-foot-long representation of the geologic time scale. The Mesozoic era, the great age of reptiles, is the time when the dinosaurs romped throughout eastern and southern Utah. There were great herds of dinosaurs that lived at various places in our state throughout the Mesozoic, but it was in the Jurassic period when they were particularly abundant and particularly diverse.
During the Jurassic time period, the Earth and Utah looked much different than it does today. If we could run the geologic clock backwards in time, we would find that the continents themselves have changed and moved. This map of Earth before the Jurassic time period represents the late Triassic period. From the late Triassic into the early Jurassic, between 230 and 187 million years ago, the Earth's single landmass called Pangaea continued to drift northward, moving away from the southern pole. During the late Jurassic, between 163 and 144 million years ago, a seaway opened up and began the separation of the landmasses from the northern and southern hemispheres. It was during this time period that inland seas from the north entered Utah and more than once flooded the land. It was not until the late Cretaceous period, between 84 and 65 million years ago, the continents of Earth began to take the shapes we recognize today. A now totally eroded mountain chain called the Mesocordilleran Highlands existed during the Jurassic period and extended the entire length of the state of Utah as seen here. This mountainous region produced easterly flowing rivers which deposited fine-grained sediment over most of the eastern interior. The dinosaur-bearing deposits, called the Morrison Formation, is made of sands and sediments created from the eroding Mesocordilleran Highlands. In eastern Utah, near the town of Vernal, Utah today, the Morrison Formation contains one of the world's greatest Jurassic dinosaur quarries. Dinosaur National Monument, as it is now called, began 145 million years ago during the Jurassic period. Here you see what this landscape may have looked like then. A bend in the river served as a catching point for dead and dying dinosaurs as their carcasses came to rest on the sandbars created by the eroding Mesocordilleran Highlands. Thousands of dinosaur bones were buried here and would remain for millions of years while the Earth experienced great changes. Floodplain deposits continue to bury the dinosaur remains. Time passed while the sands and mud of inland seas covered the dinosaur bones under thousands of feet of deposits, placing tremendous pressure on the dinosaur remains, and so pressure, mixed with mineral-laden water, fossilized the bones. As time passed, compression within the Earth's crust lifted and vaulted the strata upward, creating a natural underground arch. On the side of this arch lay the now tilted sandbars and ancient riverways containing the fossilized dinosaur remains. Erosion began to wear at the top and sides of the arch. The rich deposit of fossils locked in this sandbar tomb for more than 100 million years began to surface. Earl Douglas was the man who would find this extraordinary deposit of fossilized bones. In 1894, at the age of 32, Douglas conducted geological exploration into western Montana and taught school to pay his expenses. In 1902, Douglas became associated with the Carnegie Museum in Pittsburgh. He would work with Carnegie for nearly 2 decades. Douglas married Pearl Charlotte Gochius in 1905. She would share with him the greatest discoveries of his life. From 1907 to 1924, Douglas devoted himself to locating and studying fossil-bearing strata of the Uinta Basin in northeastern Utah. On August 17, 1909, Earl Douglas noticed 8 dinosaur tailbones protruding from the ground. For the first time in over 100 million years, these bones were basking in the light of day. Douglas recorded in his journal his astounding discovery.
At last, at the top of the ledge where the softer overlying sandstone beds form a divide, a kind of saddle, I saw 8 of the tailbones of a brontosaurus in exact position. It was a beautiful sight. Part of the ledge had weathered out, and the beautifully petrified centra lay on the ground. It was by far the best-looking dinosaur prospect I had ever found.
For more than a decade, workers labored excavating these finds in this section of the Morrison Formation. Over 100 million years had left the matrix containing the bone as hard as cement. Removal of each bone was a major undertaking. Douglas and his team of workers spent years extruding bone. Once the bones were free from the Morrison Formation matrix, they needed to be crated and taken by wagon to the nearest railroad station for final transportation back to the Carnegie Museum. Over 300 tons of bone and matrix were shipped out by Douglas and his men. Appreciation for the contributions Douglas had made to paleontology are represented in these stunning photographs of the early excavation days at Dinosaur National Monument. Even under harsh living and working conditions, there was still time for some occasional enjoyment. Douglas resigned his position with the Carnegie Museum in 1924 and was employed by the University of Utah to excavate dinosaur bones for their museum. On September 17, 1924, wagon loads of dinosaur bones rolled into Salt Lake City. The parade crowds must have been very impressed as Wagon Master Uncle John Kay shook hands with University of Utah President George Thomas. Earl Douglas spent the remaining years of his life as a consulting geologist until his death in 1931, at the age of 69. People like Earl Douglas have spent their lives in bringing about an understanding of the Earth, its life forms, and history. Today, as then, our understanding of the world we live in is defined by such men and women. The dedication of people like Earl Douglas has encouraged many others to contribute to science in many ways. What you are looking at now is some rare footage collected in the early 1920s from Dinosaur National Monument. The silent movie this Carnegie footage was used in is called Monsters of the Past, the story of the great dinosaurs. It is interesting to follow the steps these early paleontologists took in bringing us the knowledge locked away in these stone pages.
Here at the Utah Museum of Natural History, there are 4 complete skeletons of Jurassic Age dinosaurs on display. These animals all lived in Utah around 150 million years ago, And their remains were originally discovered at the Cleveland Lloyd Quarry in Emery County. That's about 25 miles south of Price. The excavations were conducted between the years 1960 and 1965 by University of Utah scientists. After those excavations were completed, each individual bone had to be carefully cleaned of the rock matrix that surrounded it. The various fragments had to be reassembled to make complete bones. And then, of course, remember that in any one of these skeletons, there's between 200 and 300 bones. Heavy steel pipes had to be fashioned into armatures to support the weight of those skeletons. The research on the kinds of dinosaurs had to be performed. The labels had to be developed, the copy had to be written, and of course the scenery and the sets had to be designed so that they're accurate according to our perceptions of the Jurassic world. Whenever you see dinosaur skeletons in museum exhibits, know that that represents thousands of hours of work by perhaps dozens of people, and that entire effort can often encompass more than 20 years.
Dinosaurs were world travelers, and the Dinosaur National Monument Quarry include the same animals that roamed in China and southeastern Africa during the late Jurassic period.
As spectacular as this immense dinosaur quarry is, it really only tells us part of the story. To understand the entire complex ecosystem in which these dinosaurs lived, we need to collect at other localities elsewhere in the park and take both the fossils and the geological information at those many diverse sites and bring it together so that we can better understand this ecosystem buried in the rocks of the Morrison Formation.
Utah dinosaurs found at the National Dinosaur Monument Quarry include Camarasaurus, or chamber lizard, referring to the hollow area in its vertebra. Diplodocus, inferring double beam because of the T-shaped bones located in its tail. Apatosaurus, or deceptive lizard, this because of its almost unbelievable size. Allosaurus, or other lizard, this creature's bones were unlike anything discovered before it. Stegosaurus, the plated lizard, the backplates on this animal earned it this distinctive name. Camptosaurus, the bent lizard, named for one of its hip bones. Recently, at Dinosaur National Monument, one of the most extraordinary kind of fossil remains have been found. The embryo of a plant-eating dinosaur called Camptosaurus. Embryos from rocks of this age are extremely rare. The embryo found here is the best specimen that has been found in the Morrison Formation.
It was a really lucky find and kind of indicates the role of serendipity in paleontology. The excavations were going on in a layer looking for plant fossils, and they started to dig at a slightly deeper layer and found some small bones, which initially in the field we thought might be fish.
Once back in the lab, it was thought that the embryo might actually be a lizard. It was only later, when all the material was exposed, that it was realized that this specimen was a dinosaur, the remains of an embryo, an animal that never had the opportunity to hatch out of its egg.
Think for a second about how extraordinarily fortunate we are to have this specimen. 145 million years ago, a small embryonic dinosaur died before hatching and happened to be in an area where the egg and the embryo could be buried and then fossilized before it decayed. Then 150 million years later, through a long history of compression of sediments, folding of beds, burial of beds, erosion, all of those factors avoided damaging this fossil. And then just a year or two ago, it was exposed close to the surface, and one of our field crew was there and happened to stumble across it while digging for plant fossils. This is an example of how really remarkable it is that any kind of fossil is found, not just embryos of a dinosaur. This block was really critical in helping us to identify the kind of embryo that this specimen is. Here you can see the two bones, the scapula and the coracoid, that form the shoulder blade. This long bone is the humerus, or the upper arm bone. And then along here are a series of vertebrae belonging to the base of the neck and the front part of the trunk. The most critical bone in all of this is the coracoid, this little rectangular bone here. A rectangular coracoid is present only in Camptosaurus, of all the dinosaurs in the Morrison Formation. And on the basis of that bone alone, we were able to tell what kind of dinosaur this was. This black bone is actually the brain case of the oldest known tyrannosaurid dinosaur. You can see here the occipital condyle, the sphere where the neck vertebrae would articulate with the skull. And here we can see the floor of the brain case. This is the surface on which the brain actually rested. There's a lot of peculiar anatomical features in this brain case. This brain case didn't come from Dinosaur National Monument, but from the Cleveland Lloyd Quarry in south central Utah. Many people think of dinosaurs only as large animals, but in fact, there were many small dinosaurs. This tooth belongs to a small carnivorous dinosaur known as Coparian. Probably reached no longer than maybe 2 feet as an adult. But still, you can see, even in a tiny tooth like this, adaptations for eating other animals. You can see serrations along the front and along the back of the tooth. And the tooth actually curves in at the front, and there was a constriction between the crown of the tooth and the root. Those turned out to be very critical features for identifying this as being a type of carnivorous dinosaur known as a troodont. Here's an enlargement of the denticles from the back side of the tooth, enlarged about 220 times. And you can see in between the serrations these circular pits. And these are called blood pits, and they're another feature that are found only in troodont dinosaurs. It was an example of one of the subtle features that helped us to identify this particular group and the kind of dinosaur, this particular tooth, and the kind of dinosaur that it came from. I'm holding in my hand the remains of a new carnivorous dinosaur found last year at Dinosaur National Monument. We've named this Coparian, and the fossil consists of a single microscopic but diagnostic tooth. Now this tooth is small, only about 2 millimeters high. You can get a sense of how small that is by looking at it next to my hand. This particular animal probably was no larger than maybe 2 feet as an adult.
What I'm working on is the hand of a juvenile Dryosaurus. Dryosaurus is one of those small plant-eating dinosaurs that we had living back 140 million years ago, right around this area. Now, whenever you find a fairly complete skeleton, you're always really anxious to see if the head, the hands, and the feet are there, because those tended to be the first things dinosaurs lost. And that kind of makes sense. If you think of your own body, your neck and your ankles and your wrists are the joints that you have the most motion in, and they're held by, just muscles and ligaments for the most part. And when a dinosaur died, those muscles and ligaments would quickly decay, and the hands and the feet and the head would float away from the rest of the body. So hands, heads, and feet are very, very rare. This again is just a beautiful specimen of the hand of a Dryosaurus, and you can see that it looks an awful lot like it did when the dinosaur was still using this hand. You can see the small little joints, phalanges, we call them, that lead up to the claws at the end. Now it's not completely complete. We're missing a couple little phalanges and then one back here in the back. But when you think that this is actually 140 million years old, that's pretty darn complete.
Even with all the changes the continents have experienced over the last 100 million years, there remain similarities today to this ancient land. Not far from Dinosaur National Monument itself runs the modern-day Yampa River. This river is reminiscent of that ancient river, the Jurassic collector of so many well-preserved bones. The lands surrounding the massive dinosaur finds at Dinosaur National Monument have many stories to tell about life in the Jurassic, both large and small.
What I'm preparing here are some of the more recent finds made at Dinosaur National Monument. What we have are a number of fairly complete skeletons of some of the oldest and best preserved salamanders found in the world. These little skeletons are important because most of the bones of this type found throughout the rest of the world are usually made up of isolated vertebra or an occasional limb bone. But what we have here are actually fairly complete skeletons of several individual salamanders. Why are we studying salamanders? We're interested in piecing together the whole ecosystem that lived in the Upper Jurassic in this area, not just the large dinosaurs, but the mammals, the salamanders, the lizards, the frogs, all of the creatures that made up this Jurassic ecosystem.
Most people associate the Jurassic with the large land-living dinosaurs. But in fact, even here in Utah, there were marine deposits during the Jurassic that had animals like the ichthyosaurs in them. This cast of an ichthyosaur is similar to those found in our rocks here in eastern Utah. Interestingly enough, during the Jurassic, there were two pulses of seas coming into Utah. Both of them came from the north, around the Sierra Nevada area, and into the western United States of Wyoming and a little bit of Idaho, into Utah and Colorado. In the Jurassic, we have many different environments preserved. We have the sand dunes of the Navajo sandstone, then we have the ocean in the Carmel Formation, then that ocean withdraws and we have more sand dunes, the Entrada sandstone, which is well represented in Arches National Park. Then the sea comes back in and we have the Curtis Formation. It withdraws and we have the Morrison Formation, the final formation of the Jurassic.
Dinosaur tracks are found in land deposits such as Jurassic sands that were deposited in the wind-blown sand dunes. In the oases associated with those dunes, there are found dinosaur tracks. Along what was the beach edges of ancient oceans, there are dinosaur tracks. And finally, in the Morrison Formation, not only are there dinosaur tracks, but there are also dinosaur bones. The only formation that has dinosaur bones in the Jurassic in Utah. You are looking at a fossil display located in the Prehistory Museum at the College of Eastern Utah. These specimens were excavated at the Cleveland Lloyd Dinosaur Quarry, another of the world's great Jurassic quarries located about 25 miles south and east of Price, Utah. At least 12,000 bones have been removed from this quarry, with over 300 specimens now showing in museums all over the world. One of the most efficient killing machines that has ever been discovered is called the Utah Raptor. Recently, this animal has been unearthed under the direction of Don Burge, director of the Prehistory Museum at the College of Eastern Utah.
Currently, there's a popular movie out on dinosaurs featuring a specimen that I have in my hand. This is called a raptor. And I'd like to tell you how this raptor was discovered. It happened kind of like this. In eastern Utah, near Moab, I'm the person responsible for the mapping, and I am the quarry boss. And this particular bone was exposed like this, and Carl Lamoni, who was working for me, was doing the digging, and I was drawing this on the map. And it was decided that this must be the neck rib, or what's called a cervical rib. And as Carl progressed further and further back, finally exposing this much of it, it became very obvious that what we had was a claw of a raptor. So that's how this thing was discovered. So this turns out to be the largest claw of a raptor, we think, in the world. And since that time, we have discovered the great claw on the front limb. This, of course, the one I just had out is the hind limb, the great claw on the back toe. And then it had this on the front toe. And last summer, actually it was 2 years ago, we discovered this claw. And also the part of the skull. We have the upper jaw, what is called the premaxilla. This would fit something like this. And you can see the teeth. These are the teeth of a meat eater, a carnivore. And we have also the other side. And so these pieces do fit together like so. And this will give us an idea of the size of this thing. And we also have part of the lower jaw, the mandible. And so this part here would fit kind of like this back here. So this would articulate right in through here. And so this gives us a good idea of the kind of animal, the size of this animal. And if I take this and I compare this to the Allosaurus, I could show you about what the size of this animal, what it would be, and something about it, as far as, in this case, being a meat eater. We'll go over here now and match this to the Allosaurus. All right, now if we take the premaxilla and we fit it, say, right about here. Let's see if I can hold that so you can see it. You can see that's not too bad of a fit. The teeth here, perhaps just a little bit shorter, but it pretty well covers the space from here to here. We feel that this specimen, of course it's 125 million years old, this is 150, but this specimen was about this size, perhaps a little shorter this way, maybe like that, this being a little flattened like this, and maybe 20 feet in length. The claws of the raptor would be, the front claw would be about this much longer, this much, from here to here. And so it's about 7 inches, whereas the great claw on the back foot's about 8 inches. And we think that's only the core of the claw, and if you were to put a sheath on it, the claw could perhaps go as much as 12 inches. So this is a real killing machine. Perhaps the fiercest killing machine of all the past. Who can say?
Marshsaurus was a relatively small, slender, swift-moving carnivore that lived during the late Jurassic period in Utah and was about 12 feet in length, weighing 1 ton. This animal has been discovered at the Cleveland Lloyd Quarry and now at the Dinosaur National Monument Quarry as well.
Here in this block of rock, we have the remains of another carnivorous dinosaur, this time the partial skull of the rare meat-eater Marshsaurus. Now the skull has been disarticulated. All the bones are separate from one another. But this irregular shaped piece of bone is the brain case. This V-shaped bone is the maxilla, and that's the main element in the skull that bears the tooth row, which you can see right along here. And then this long, thin bone is the nasal bone, which sits on top of the maxilla. And we also have another bone, the premaxilla, that sits on the front. So what we have of this skull is not just the brain case, but the entire snout at the front end of the skull. And that's more skull material of Marshsaurus than has ever been found in one place before.
Storing a collection of dinosaur bones requires lots of space. Here at the Utah Museum of Natural History, about 5,000 square feet of storage space is dedicated to house the dinosaur bone collection. Like any group of animals, dinosaurs suffered injuries and diseases in the course of their life. In this drawer, there's a small bone from the forelimb, the arm of an Allosaurus. Notice that it's offset. It has a bend in it, and where that bend occurs, there's a huge callus of bone. This represents a fractured bone, a bone that was broken during the lifetime of the Allosaurus and healed in place. It almost certainly immobilized the forelimb of the animal. It must have had great difficulty grasping objects.
Maybe 5% of the bones from the Cleveland Lloyd Quarry show some kind of pathologic deformity. So of 12,000 bones, perhaps 600 had some kind of disease or whatever, like you see here. We're looking at a toe bone of a healthy dinosaur here, and in my right hand I have the same bone or a similar bone that shows some kind of a terrible growth or disease, whether this is cancer or whether this is some kind of a arthritic condition, I cannot say, but clearly this is not normal. And so dinosaurs suffered from many of the pathologic deformities that humans today suffer from.
Imagine what happens to dinosaur bones after they've been buried in the earth for 100 or 150 million years. We can illustrate what happens to some of those bones if we examine the bone of a modern animal. This is the leg bone of a horse. It's been cut in half so that we can see the inside. Notice that the inside of the horse bone is very spongy and porous. This bone is from a mastodon, an elephant that was common in North America during the Ice Age, and it's about 30,000 years old. During that time, minerals have been deposited in the open spaces in the interior of the bone, and it's increased the weight of the bone by a few pounds, but it's still pretty much unaltered bone. This bone is from the Jurassic Period. It's about 150 million years old, and it's heavily mineralized. Every one of the small open spaces in the interior of this bone is filled with mineral matter, and the bone is very heavy in comparison to our mastodon or to our horse bone. Everybody knows that dinosaurs were the biggest land-living creatures ever in the history of the Earth. But not all dinosaurs were big. The baby dinosaurs hatched out of eggs that were no more than about a foot long, and as they were newborn, they were probably only about 15, 16 inches. This is a small bone from the thigh, it's the femur, of an Allosaurus, Utah state fossil. This animal probably stood only 3 feet tall or so, and this was a baby. This bone represents the very same thigh bone of an adult Allosaurus. We find the remains of dinosaurs preserved at all stages in life, from very tiny dinosaurs to very large dinosaurs.
It is interesting to note the pelvic differences in the two orders of dinosaurs. Note the shape and position of the pubis bone in this dinosaur hip structure. It faces forward. This order is called Saurischians. The second order of dinosaurs' pubis structure faced backwards, as you see here. This order is called Ornithischians.
When many people think about dinosaurs, they envision a group of large reptiles that was pretty much the same. But in fact, the individual dinosaurs were much different from one another. We recognize two broad subdivisions of the animals that we call dinosaurs, and those subdivisions are based on the way the pelvis of each is constructed. In the dinosaur pelvis, there's 3 bones. There's a large blade, which is the ilium. There's a pubis bone, which extends downward. And there's the ischium, which extends directly beneath the pelvis. In one group called the Saurischians, the pubis and the ischium diverge from one another. This group characterizes animals like Allosaurus, Tyrannosaurus, and the huge sauropod dinosaurs such as our familiar Brontosaurus. The second main group of dinosaurs, known as the Ornithischians. In the pelvis of an ornithischian, the pubis and the ischium are parallel to one another, and they extend vertically down underneath the rest of the pelvis. Among the ornithischians are some very familiar plant-eating dinosaurs. The Stegosaurus with the plates, the 3-horned Triceratops, and all of the duck-billed dinosaurs are members of this group. It's important to remember that all of the ornithischian dinosaurs are no more closely related to the Saurischians than you and I are to elephants.
One of the most interesting things about the study of dinosaurs is finding highly polished rocks with the bones. These highly polished rocks are called gastroliths. Gastroliths were probably picked up by the dinosaurs and used as grinding mechanisms for their food. Many birds today will swallow grit with their food. The grit is retained in their gizzard and is used to help grind and digest their meal. Dinosaurs, it appears, did the same thing. Some dinosaurs, like Allosaurus, seem to have bird-like characteristics, while others, like Camptosaurus, seem to have more reptilian characteristics. A question asked about the nature of dinosaurs is whether or not they were warm or cold-blooded. In order to get a handle on their physiology, David Smith, a graduate student at Brigham Young University, has attempted to correlate growth curves with modern warm-blooded animals, such as mammals, and cold-blooded animals, like reptiles. In the modern record, cold-blooded animals tend to grow continuously and at a different rate than do warm-blooded animals. If the shape of the curve that these animals grow along can be determined, along with whether or not they grew continuously, then warm or cold-bloodedness can be determined.
My tentative results suggest that they grew continuously throughout life, and they were probably therefore cold-blooded. This does not, however, suggest that they were sluggish. They could have maintained a very high metabolism, a very high activity level.
One of the most profound changes in our perception is the realization that many dinosaurs may have been warm-blooded. But how do you suppose you determine if an extinct animal is warm or cold-blooded when all you have are the fossil bones to study? There are a number of small pieces of circumstantial evidence that allow us, I think, to make a pretty good case that at least most of the dinosaurs were probably warm-blooded. First of all, the dinosaurs were distributed from pole to pole all over the planet. Wherever there was land, there were dinosaurs. That kind of distribution is not what we expect of a cold-blooded animal, as in the case of today's snakes, which are concentrated in the warm tropical regions. We can also look at the structure of dinosaur bone, and in those bones we see a very open, porous structure in the interior. In life, there were tremendous volumes of blood and other body fluids that were surging through the interior of dinosaur bones, and the blood constituents were being continuously replaced. That's a trait of a warm-blooded animal. Finally, there are far too few dinosaur predators found in the fossil record for them to have been cold-blooded animals. If dinosaurs were cold-blooded, we would expect to see many more predators in relation to the amount of plant-eating herbivorous animals that are found in the fossil record. Warm-blooded animals generally have just a very small proportion of the population represented among the carnivores, and that's exactly the ratio we see in the case of dinosaur fossils.
How much information is available to scientists to enable them to reconstruct what dinosaurs actually looked like? Pioneers in this field, Stephen and Sylvia Zerkis, recently moved from Los Angeles to southern Utah, where they are recreating ancient animals both scientifically accurate and beautifully realistic. As well as being an accomplished artist, Stephen is a world expert on dinosaur skin.
As a paleontologist, what I do is I study dinosaur skin, not just the bones, but the actual skin, which is sometimes preserved, not too often. It's extremely rare. But when it is, it actually allows a scientist to observe what a dinosaur truly looks like. And taking that information from fossilized skin impressions, I'm also very fortunate in being an artist, so that I can take that impression of fossil skin and literally transfer it onto a clay sculpture. I take molds from that detail off the fossil and then literally impress clay back into those molds, which I can peel out a piece of skin and then transfer it onto the muscles of a sculpture that I've built up over the actual bones. This is a model of the Herrerasaurus, an early dinosaur, one of the very earliest dinosaurs known from Argentina. And from this, all the other dinosaurs basically evolved. And I'm restoring the entire animal. It's right now just with its skull exposed, but within this entire animal, there is a copy of the entire skeleton. And that's how I actually work, is from the skeleton up. The skeleton, just as in life, is an armature from which I build the muscles in clay. And once I have all the muscles then built up over the skeletal replica, then I actually take replicas of actual dinosaur skin and take that, in this case, a sheet of scales and skin, and literally transfer it onto the musculature. And in this case, of course, there's no muscles on the skull. There would be the eye here in this socket. The nose is here. This is an extra opening characteristic of dinosaurs. This would all be filled in with muscles, and then we transfer the skin onto it and build up all of the layers of skin, and then go back in and fine tool where the different sheets of skin come together and blend in all the different scales. And eventually what you would end up with is a complete skull looking something like what we have over here. Now here we have the upper portion of the skull of Herrerasaurus. The muscles have all been applied onto it. The eye is put into its socket. Here we have a portion of the skull where it's still exposed, just where the muscles would be. We take a sheet of skin, just a thin sheet of clay, that's been pressed into the mold of the skin, the actual fossil skin, and we then transfer it directly back over the muscles. Once we do that, then we trim off different parts of excess skin, and basically we blend in the where the skin would blend into the next piece of applied skin, and end up with an animal looking something complete. And the skull, when it's complete, would look something like this. And once again, this was sculpted directly over a copy of the skull and allows us to build up the skin over the muscles, putting the eye in, and end up with an animal that's a fair more realistic than what people might expect of dinosaurs. I have an actual piece of fossilized dinosaur skin right here. And now if we take it outside in the light, we could look at it much better. This little fragment of stone here has dinosaur skin impressions preserved right on it. And we can identify what kind of dinosaur this goes to based on the kind of scalation, and in particular this one large cluster of scales, which forms a very large tubercle, kind of like scute or ornamentation that is identifiable. You see it all the time on particular kinds of duck-billed dinosaurs. The skin impressions are actually preserved not only on this surface of the rock, but even on the other side. There's an impression of skin where it must have folded over, and we find that very often where the skin is preserved in very convoluted shapes throughout the matrix surrounding the actual bone. But the scalation is made of tiny tubercles, very small scales that don't actually overlap like modern reptiles do. It's a characteristic that's much more primitive, and you see it in reptiles that live in rainforests and tropical jungles. Recently, at the annual meetings of paleontology, we presented a talk that explains what duck-billed dinosaurs should look like. And a new observation that I made was based on the neck. What we have here are 4 drawings, 2 of duckbills and 2 of just your ordinary horse. And what we have is a particular study on the neck. Now this is the skeleton and body outline of a common horse, which of course we're very familiar with what it looks like, so we know that it has this kind of profile. But now if we had no skin impressions, the problem is we may actually end up interpreting this skeleton as having a very slender neck and ending up with a creature something like this, which of course is far from what we now know a horse to look like. The same kind of problems we always are facing with reconstructing dinosaurs because we haven't seen them firsthand. Okay. This drawing is a conservative, very traditional interpretation of a duck-billed dinosaur, which has a very slender goose-like neck. But in actuality, I believe we've been making mistakes and interpreting this animal to have a slender neck, when in actuality, just as a horse actually has a very deep neck and muscles go across here, and the animal would look more like this, with a very deep neck instead of a slender goose-like neck. And skin impressions from mummified dinosaurs, especially duckbills, have literally proven that this is what the animal should look like. So what we know is that from the shape of the manner in which the death pose is always found with articulated specimens, the skull is pulled back over the body, bending the neck backwards. And this is typical. This is exactly the same pose that you would find a dead horse that has died in the prairie and has naturally withered and become dried and desiccated and naturally mummified. And this is what happens is the muscles that are connecting over the back onto the neck supporting the skull simply dry and contract, which pulls the neck back. The head goes back into what is known as the death pose. This is a new discovery that I made on long-necked dinosaurs. This is a Diplodocus, which is basically a relative of Apatosaurus, the brontosaur that everyone is so familiar with. And the discovery is about the ornamentation of what it looks like. Its body outline is changed. The discovery that I made was that we now know that these dinosaurs have spike-like ornamentation running at least all the way of the tail and perhaps the entire length of the body and neck. The reason that we know that brontosaurs and Diplodocus now have ornamentation on their body is because we've actually found fossil skin impressions. In the quarries where bones are actually found, occasionally we run across skin impressions, impressions of what the body outline and details truly look like. It's like looking at the actual animal. It's the closest thing you can ever get to knowing what a dinosaur really looks like. And in this case, we found not just skin impressions of the side of the body, but skin impressions literally running right down the top of the animal, especially right over the tail. And much to everyone's surprise, we actually found spike-like elements of skin and scalation that is much more similar to what you might expect on modern reptiles, say like on the tail or the back of a iguana.
The Earth itself is the record keeper that holds between its pages the secrets of the past. Here, in Arches National Park, thousands of feet of Jurassic deposits have been laid down. Over millions of years, these great walls of Entrada sandstone have been eroding. Today, these pillars to the past have created a challenge for man. The challenge can be physical, or they can be a challenge for the mind. A challenge to read what nature had written between the pages of hundreds of millions of years. Goblin Valley, located in southern Utah, also represents deposits which have been there since the Jurassic. These amazing shapes are the products of erosion. Land formations laid down during the Jurassic include these desert vistas, as seen south of Arches National Park. The age of reptiles has been replaced by the age of mammals much sooner than this Navajo sandstone has had time to erode. You are looking into Horseshoe Canyon, where another mammal has left its mark upon the Jurassic sands of time. Deep in this canyon, Native Americans, sometime between 2,000 and 7,000 years ago, recorded their understanding of life on these ancient Jurassic walls. Over 100 million years needed to pass before human artists would inscribe their mark on these pages of time. But how recent is their mark? What impact on the history of the Earth does the appearance of Homo sapiens represent? It is interesting to note how short man's reign on Earth has been in comparison to the 180 million year reign of the dinosaurs. This is a 24-hour clock. One 24-hour period on this clock represents the 4.5 billion year history of Earth from creation until now. About 5:30 this morning, or 3.5 billion years ago, simple life made its appearance upon the Earth. It was not until 20 minutes to 9 this evening that diverse and complex organisms made their appearance on Earth 600 million years ago. Between 10:30 and 11:30 this evening, the age of the dinosaur occurred. All three time periods, which are collectively called the Mesozoic era, were ruled for about 180 million years by the dinosaurs. First, during the Triassic, which lasted for about 35 million years, followed by the Jurassic period, which went on for about 69 million years. Finally, the Cretaceous period, lasting for about 79 million years. ending the reign of the dinosaurs 65 million years ago.
Perhaps the most enduring mystery about dinosaurs is what happened to them. Why did they become extinct? Paleontologists have no simple answers to that question, but there are many theories. Some people believe that diseases may have played a role in the disappearance of the dinosaurs, while others point to volcanic activity, changes in the Earth's climate, and the possible impact between the Earth and an asteroid. No one knows for sure, and the truth may be that several things combined to lead to the extinction.
Our species, Homo sapiens, took consciousness 100,000 years ago. On our 24-hour geological clock, that would be at the 11th hour, 59th minute, and 58th second of the day, or just 2 seconds before midnight. The dinosaurs' longevity on Earth makes them one of the most successful life forms to have ever lived on the planet. With such rich deposits layered in Utah, we can look forward to many more revealing discoveries to be uncovered in the future.